At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Mike Harvey. He is the primary architect for this wonderful series that we'll be presenting all this fall. And so I'd like to say thank you very much from NTACT and for initiating this collaboration with ACTE and your university. So thank you very much, Mike, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Deanna. Appreciate it. Folks, we're delighted to have you participating in this webinar series on career and technical education for students with disabilities. Today's is the first of a 5-series webinar structure, as Deanna's talked about. We're basically going to cover CTE for students with disabilities and create a framework for understanding in today's webinar. We could jump to the next slide. The agenda is pretty straightforward. We welcome you, and the ground rules Deanna has spoken to. What we would do is ask, please, that if you do have technical issues, that you work with NTASC crew in the chat box and then the Q&A box for question and answers, and we'll have time at the end. I'd like to take just a couple of minutes to introduce our panel members. We're delighted to bring you excellent experts from the field, and that's kind of a push in my direction, if you will, but I'm Dr. Michael Harvey. I'm a professor of education in the Workforce Education and Development program at Penn State University. I'm going to talk about background, workforce development, and CTE concentrators. We have Susan Theriault, who is the Director of College and Career Readiness in the Success Center, and also Tessie Bailey, who's the Principal Technical Assistant Consultant for AIR, which is the American Institutes for Research. They're going to talk about federal legislation that supports education to the workforce. Catherine Imperator is the research manager for the Association for Career and Technical Education. Catherine is going to talk to us about the new Perkins V legislation and also ACTE's mission and vision and their services and supports for special populations. And last but not least, we have Patrick Biggerstaff, who is the director of CTE and adult education at Area 31 programs at MSD Wayne Township in Indianapolis. Patrick also is the vice president of the ACTE CTE Administrative Division, and he'll talk to us about perspectives from the field and what the Area 31 programs in the Indianapolis area are doing related to students with disabilities in career and technical ed. We'll have time for Q&A, and then we'll do a wrap-up. And with that, we'll move on. My portion is to just establish talking points and background that will help us to review the framework. And for some of you, some of the information I may share is not new information, but I do think it's important to understand the parameters and then just have a basic understanding of the CTE, Perkins legislation, and special education ideal legislation, so we can kind of distinguish that and then talk about the overlap and the information that's of importance. We can go to the next one. With background, it's critically important to understand that there is a relationship between education and economics, particularly in U.S. educational supports and services. When we think about education and economics, the link is workforce development. So putting that in perspective, in education at the secondary level, we have career and technical education programs that offer occupationally specific skills training delineated towards business and industry jobs and occupations that allow people to move into either post-secondary education where they gain further information or directly into the workforce. By its very nature, CTE is part of workforce development, which is education and training in business and industry for occupations. Workforce development is a critical link to economics, because if we're training and educating people for jobs, then that obviously is a support system for economic development, and it has an economic tie. We want to make sure that students have competencies and they're competent, and that they have skills that allow them to be competitive, and that they have opportunities for jobs in the 21st century. That competitiveness also establishes a competitiveness with market share for the U.S. economy. Beyond that, we need to look at legislation and understand that Perkins legislation supports career and technical education, and that within the Perkins legislation, we have a group that is considered special populations. That grouping of individuals in special populations are identified in the Perkins legislation, and career and technical education at all levels supports the engagement of special populations, which includes individuals with disabilities, typically defined in the Perkins Act under ADA's definition. We also need to pay attention to special education law, and special education law governs what happens for students with disabilities. The current legislation is IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And an important piece for this discussion is background information on transition mandate, which occurred in the 1990 legislation. In the transition mandate, students with a disability at the secondary level needed to have transition goals with post-school outcomes included in their individualized educational programs. This consisted of outcome goals post-school in education, training, employment, and independent living. Next. IDEA basically provides special education supports and services to those students who are identified by one or more of 12 disability categories. It assures free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment, and students have an IEP that's written for them. The IEP includes supports, accommodations, the kinds of learning activities and modifications that may be needed, and also transition services. It really is a roadmap, a blueprint, if you will, of the kinds of supports, the kinds of services that special education provides for that student to benefit from public education involvement. Those are written by an IEP team that's made up of administrators and parents, students where appropriate, and other educational and other support staff. CTE members should be part of this particular IEP team for those students at the secondary level who are either considering CTE program placement or are currently in program placement. And transition services really become a critical piece in making that link to CTC. The IDEA mandate currently speaks to students who are 16 years old or older, having transition services and transition goals in their IEP that specify post-secondary goals in education, training, and employment, and where appropriate, independent living. And those post-secondary goals in the IEP are based on the student's individual needs, accounting for strengths, interests, and preferences. I would add, in looking at secondary CTE placement, we also need to consider the issue of ability in relationship to occupationally specific skills training in business and industry, which is what CTE provides. The federal regulations also speak to the fact that students have this coordinated set of services that are in an outcome-oriented, results-oriented process that addresses both academic and functional needs. For students with disabilities at the secondary level in CTE, it's important to understand those academic and functional skills are met through occupational skills development. Next. Can we go back one? Thanks. No, forward one. Sorry, my mistake. Perkins also speaks to a number of different things. The Perkins legislation has been with us since 1984. Perkins V is the new iteration passed in 2018. CTE is designed for secondary, post-secondary, and adult populations, and it focuses on CTE improvement across program areas. There are a variety of different purposes in CTE, but one of those is to develop challenging academic and technical standards in high skills, high wage, and high demand occupations that are geographically situated. Also, we want to integrate programs of study between secondary and post-secondary for students in career and technical education, so there is a continuum of program services. The Perkins Act also supports partnerships, and I know Catherine will speak to this in more detail, but that's basically career and technical education, working with local investment boards, working with business and industry, and expanding those partnerships to work with VR and WIOA to make sure that we're doing the right things in CTE to support those who participate in programs. And last but not least, CTE is really designed to help provide and increase employment opportunities for those who are underemployed and unemployed, and the legislation specifically speaks to individuals with disabilities. The legislation also includes a number of things, which are that in the legislation, Perkins V, there's a professional development that is actually purported and supported for CTE teachers. And basically CTE teachers working with students with disabilities need to have knowledge and skills to best to provide instruction and support. These include positive behavior interventions, multi-tiered supports, and most importantly, the kinds of accommodations that are needed to be made in a CTE setting that's unique compared to other programs in public education. Two key terms I want to highlight. One of those is a CTE participant and a CTE concentrator. A CTE participant is at the secondary level is a student who completes not less than one course in a career and technical ed program or a program of study. These are folks that are using CTE in an exploratory nature, where our webinar series are going to focus in on those students who are CTE concentrators. And at the secondary level, these are students who are completing at least two courses in a single program area or a single program of study area. So these would be students who are interested in cosmetology, for an example, dental assistant as an example, early childhood, auto tech skills, and also carpentry as occupational skills area. It's occupational skills training for those who are concentrators. And that's what we're going to concentrate on in this webinar series, no pun intended. Next. Perkins also identifies special populations, and special populations really are delineated in 9 different groupings of individuals in the Perkins legislation. It's important, I think, for this webinar and background as we look at establishing really a foundation and a framework to understand that students with disabilities are among a larger group of students that Perkins speaks to in special populations. Having said that, next, please. I think it's important to look at access and equity and really establishing the framework. I've used a Venn diagram here to set the parameters, particularly for students who are interested in occupationally specific skills training. CTE, as we remember, is governed by Perkins. Perkins basically says that CTE is an elective course of studies at the secondary level, and those students who choose this elective as concentrators are actually focused on occupationally specific skills training in business and industry that will lead to post-secondary education, or it will lead to employment. Under students with disabilities, these students are covered by the IDEA legislation in special education, and they meet the special education qualifying criteria. And these students have an IEP that delineates special education support services and related services. The important piece here is to know that in this graphic, as a Venn diagram, the piece that's in the middle are those students with special needs, those students identified with a disability, the secondary level, who are actually in career and technical education. And you can see that the key with this is to look at fit. And when you take a look at fit, it's important to understand occupational skills specific training in industry areas that lead to jobs, understanding that those young people with occupational skills training are looking to find skills that will help move them towards business and industry and employment in their chosen occupational area. We also need to be mindful of students with disabilities and their individual needs, their strengths, their preferences, preferences and their interests. I think that that's critical in aligning CTE and making an appropriate program fit. And last but not least, I think we need to talk about ability in the context of employment and interest and outcomes. When we take those things into consideration and have honest discussions, I think we will meet the transition goals of the IEP in identifying realistic post-school outcomes for secondary students with disabilities who want to concentrate in CTE. All of this happens at the local level, and it really is predicated on the relationship that special education professionals build with CTE professionals, and working together in a partnership is going to create a win-win for CTE, a win-win for special education, but most importantly, a win-win for students. And I hope that we can use this model as kind of the framework for success. And I'm going to pass to Susan and Tessie. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. My name is Susan Theriault, and you can also see Tessie Bailey, my colleague, who is also pictured in the video. I'm going to start off, and then I'm going to hand off to Tessie. So first, I'd love to just begin with a little bit of a background. So I'm the director of the College and Career Readiness and Success Center at AIR. We're a federally funded content center, and we support states in the implementation of college and career readiness visions, programs, initiatives, et cetera, that are really aligned with individual state priorities. That's a huge topic, and that has brought us a lot of places in the past 7 years that we've been doing this work. And frankly, we've mostly had been doing work in the K-12 area until about 3 years ago, when we started to acknowledge the feedback that we continually heard from our key state stakeholders as well as local stakeholders. And we decided to try to do something about it. So for this to really work, all of this to work really together and to think through an education to workforce pipeline that is aligned rather, you really need to bring together multiple pieces of legislation and multiple actors and stakeholders within a state or local regions to bring it together in meaningful ways and create a coherent pipeline. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I already covered this one. And so what does it take? So we sat down and said, okay, what does it take to do this type of work? And the vision you see before you is like a cauldron, and we started to throw in all the elements that we thought were pretty important. So academic standards, employer needs, labor market demands, bringing together skills and interests of students, different types of students, different interests, different pathways, different ways to access this on-the-job training, post-secondary education, post-secondary training, or even post-secondary training within secondary and rethinking secondary. So we started thinking through this whole cauldron and realized, okay, we're ready, we're gonna do this, we have this big idea, we wanna help states create an aligned education to workforce pipeline. And basically what happened was we embarked on this journey. We brought some stakeholders together. We started to have some conversations with them. And we realized a few things very, very quickly. Anyone looking at these, and they're purposefully different colors, these pieces, and there's many more, will recognize that these are located in way different places in any given state or local region. And so we were running into geographic problems, like people who are just located fundamentally in different places. Structural issues in terms of silos. We've all talked about silos. There are plenty of those. Programmatic silos, resources allocation and silos. And it was making it very difficult for people to get together. But I'm going to say the thing that actually really happened that pushed us to this resource that I'm about to share with you was a conversation with a state CTE director who was working with it in the SEA to start to think through how to broaden access to career and technical education. And we were talking about the ESSA stakeholder engagement sessions. I'm sure many of you participated in these. And I said, oh, well, did you share any of your ideas about how you could connect to other parts of the agency during those sessions? And the response to me was, well, I don't really know ESSA that well, so I didn't really feel comfortable. And I realized quickly that information is also siloed, and people's deep knowledge and deep expertise that they have within these different pieces of federal legislation actually can become barriers because it makes it difficult to talk to one another. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So as we were talking about this, and as we were, ESSA had just been, it was 2015, actually 2016, by the time we were doing this, ESSA had just been reauthorized, ESEA had been reauthorized to ESSA. We were analyzing it, and we were noticing a few things. We were noticing a few handshakes to Perkins, we thought, and stronger connections to IDEA and possibly even WIOA. And we started talking about how that could really build into, a state's college and career readiness vision. And then Perkins V happened. Perkins was reauthorized, and we started to see even more of it. And we saw huge opportunities as we started to analyze these pieces of legislation. And we picked these pieces of legislation because we thought they were really important pieces of creating a coherent education to workforce pipeline. And we saw many opportunities, both in terms of resources, programs, accountability, to bring these things together. And so, next slide, please. We decided to do what I do best, is a research study on these pieces of legislation. And what we did is we created a set of codes that were based on specific areas, but most broadly in the center quadrant that you see, that we think are important for college and career readiness. This is our college and career readiness organizer. So we organize them into goals and expectations, outcomes and measures, resources and structures, pathways and supports. And then we went out. You can see you can't quite see it probably because it's small on your screen, but there's also subcategories within there. We coded each piece of legislation with when we thought it related to any piece of this, and then we did some inter-rater calibration as well as reliability testing to make sure we were all coding the same way. This says 500 pages were coded. I'm going to tell you there were a lot more than that, but that was a pretty decent estimate. And then we coded it, identified common areas where there were opportunities to think more coherently about programs, resources, and accountability mechanisms. And we put that together, our ideas together. We got feedback from state CTE directors of Title I, directors of special education, as well as ACTE and other reviewers from across the nation. And we got feedback and we put that together into a combination of things. One, a brief that provides you information that Tessie's about to share with you about key areas where you can see integration. And then two, an interactive tool where if, let's say, you know IDEA really well, you can look up portions of the law that you know and sort, and you can see across the other pieces of legislation where there may be some opportunities to make connections, build coherence, intertwine resources, rethink programs. So a more integrated approach. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Tessie.
Great. And if you look in the chat box, you'll actually see the links to those resources that Susan just mentioned. And we know that student success in CTE, students with disability success in CTE, really depends on their access and benefit from rigorous academics, their access and preparation for workforce readiness, their personalization of the supports and educator supports. And so we're going to share where we found some opportunities across the 4 acts in helping you provide these levels of services for students. So on the next slides, we're going to talk about just rigorous academics. And yep, that's right. And so just move to the next slide. Yeah, and what you'll see is in this first bullet that across both ESSA as well as Perkins, there is so with the arrows, just one more click, there's an alignment with dual enrollment. We see that the baccalaureate courses, our AP courses. And so we're able to leverage both ESSA and Perkins to ensure that students have access to rigorous academics. In addition, you'll see some alignment across around this idea of including employability skills, that we're ensuring that students have access to the necessary skills to be successful in CTE, including basic academic skills, as well as the career content skills necessary for students to meet their individual needs. And that's what, as Mike mentioned, under IDEA, we want to ensure that students have access to individualized supports for them to achieve rigorous academics. On the next slide, we'll talk about the workforce readiness, and we definitely see a lot of alignment across the 4 acts that Mike discussed. The first one is looking at this real-world application. Are we ensuring that students are learning skills that are meaningful in their ability to move to post-secondary employment outcomes? And secondly, you'll see that there's some alignment with the work-based learning across ESSA and Perkins. And so we're able to leverage all 4 acts to ensure that students with disabilities have the essential workforce readiness for post-school success. And the next slide, we talk about some of the alignment that we saw and how we can personalize supports for students within CTE. And if you look at Perkins and WIOA, we see that there's opportunities for personalized supports around career counseling, access to transportation supports. And then if you look specifically under WIOA, it's just making sure that we're taking into account students' needs around these areas of housing, transportation, and counseling needs as we're providing our individualized supports for students. In addition, you'll see that we're thinking about this the needs of the student, that we're providing obviously access to the services within a single opportunity. It's not that they're always getting their supports in special education, they're getting them in general education, but we have access to these one-stop shops that are looking at broad skill sets or broad needs. And then finally, ensuring that there's an integration of the home and family in the personalization of supports. IDEA also requires that we're engaging families in the design of these individualized supports. But as you can see, it's also highlighted in ESSA and Perkins. And finally, in the last piece, we know that it's really critical that educators, whether they're general educators, CTE, or special educators, are prepared to help students with disabilities be successful in CTE. So you'll see that there's opportunities for professional learning for both CTE and general education teachers across ESSA and Perkins. And we'll just click for that. And then in the next one, you'll see that there's also opportunities for looking at some of those underlying skills that are necessary, including developing social emotional skills under ESSA, looking at instructional practices, particularly in literacy, that are necessary for successful CTE participation. And specifically under IDEA is ensuring that there is professional learning for CTE teachers and general education teachers to successfully work with students with disabilities in those CTE environments. So I'm going to pass this over to Catherine, and Catherine's going to talk more about Perkins V specifically.
Thank you so much. I'm Catherine Parator. I'm with the Association for Career and Technical Education. If we can go ahead to the next slide, please. So we're really excited to be co-sponsoring this webinar series. I want to tell folks who are joining us who are not familiar with the association what we do and what we're about. We are the largest grassroots organization of CTE professionals. So that includes teachers, administrators, guidance counselors, institutions and organizations. Our members are the people on the ground implementing CTE programs in your local institutions and agencies. Next slide, please. And we have a number of divisions that represent all aspects of CTE, the different content areas, as well as administrators and counselors. And we also have a section dedicated to issues related to special populations, including students with disabilities. We can go on to the next one. ACTE is a federal advocacy federal advocate for CTE-related legislation and funding. We also produce a number of publications and resources for media, the general public, and policymakers explaining CTE. And we produce publications and provide professional development for our members. If you move on to the next one, please, I'm going to talk a little bit more about our newest CTE legislation, Perkins V. We are in the planning year right now, so states and local recipients are doing their needs assessment and their planning processes and preparing to write their applications that will be due this spring for funding under Perkins V. There are several changes. Mike touched on some of them, and I will dig into a few of them more in depth. There are several changes in Perkins V that are relevant to students with disabilities. There's a greater emphasis in Perkins V from Perkins IV on data-driven decision-making, also an increased focus on stakeholder engagement. There are some revisions to accountability indicators and some provisions to enhance efforts to serve special populations, including students with disabilities. So we'll go on to the next slide, please. So there are a few new definitions in Perkins, and I just want to highlight that many of these definitions help to bring the integration amongst these pieces of federal legislation more closely aligned. So there are differences. So there are new definitions related to WIOA and to the Every Student Succeeds Act that help further align those pieces of legislation. We'll move on to the next one, please. Mike touched on this already, but within the definition of special populations in Perkins, individuals with disabilities has been and continues to be an important student group within that definition, as well as some changes in the other categories under special populations related to draw a closer alignment to the Every Student Succeeds Act. Next one, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the accountability under Perkins V and some changes there. As Mike described, a few things about accountability under Perkins that I want to make clear. As Mike described, there's a participant level in CTE and then a concentrator level, a higher intensity, more focused course taking across a CTE program area. So these accountability indicators apply only to those concentrator level. And another thing to note is that the accountability is only for the overall student population. So locals and states are being held accountable for the performance of all of their students on these indicators. Now, there's required reporting in Perkins V disaggregated by student groups and even down to the program level when possible. And we definitely encourage and have heard from states that they are going to be really digging into the performance of disaggregated student groups, including students with disabilities, to look at disparities that might be masked by that overall student performance number. But what you're held accountable for is this overall student performance. So there's been some streamlining in Perkins V for what you're held accountable for. There's the graduation rate. There's a measure of academic proficiency on English, math, and science. There's a measure of transition after high school, and that could be into any kind of post-secondary education, an apprenticeship, the workforce, the military, the Peace Corps, other programs. There's a lot of options available in there, but it measures that transition to something else after secondary education. There's a measure for participation in programs that are non-traditional for that student's gender. And then there is a new indicator. Those four indicators that I just talked about are about student performance. There's a new indicator about program quality. So it's looking at programs providing opportunities for students to earn credentials, to earn post-secondary credit, and to participate in work-based learning. And right now, states are deciding if they're going to choose one of these or more than one, or there's also an option to choose one of those three options and add another indicator that is statewide and comparable across the state. So that's a little bit about accountability in Perkins V. Next, I'll talk about a few of the provisions in Perkins V that are of particular relevance. If we can move to the next slide, for students with disabilities. Again, there's a focus on that integration across federal legislation. There's also an increase in some set-aside for individuals who are in state institutions, including correctional institutions as well as institutions that may serve students with disabilities. There is a new funding set-aside for states to spend on recruiting special populations into CTE. There's an opportunity to use funding for professional development related to students with disabilities. And then I've saved the last but not least, one of the biggest changes in Perkins V is the new comprehensive local needs assessment. So if we can go to the next slide, please. The comprehensive, a new requirement in Perkins V is that local recipients of the grant must conduct a comprehensive local needs assessment, and they must use the needs that they discovered through that assessment process as the basis of what they're asking for in their local application for grant funding. Now, a lens that looks at the needs of special populations should be taken across all of these sort of 6 components of the needs assessment, but there are 2 components that are kind of particularly tied to special populations and students with disabilities. The first one is looking at that student performance data disaggregated by different student groups and down to the program level. And then also the kind of the last box on the bottom right, there is also, you're also mandated to describe your progress toward improving access and equity as part of the local needs assessment. So if we can move to the next one, please. A variety of stakeholders have to be involved in the local needs assessment, including representatives of special populations, as well as representatives across education and workforce, employers, parents and students, etc. We'll move on to the next slide, please. And this is just the description in the law that when you're looking at that access and equity component, you're looking at access, overcoming barriers, and preparing special populations for high skill, high wage, or in demand industry sectors or occupations. Obviously, you can really, this is a pretty broad description that you can really dig in, and locals can really be looking at a lot of different aspects of their programs, what they offer, their alignment to their labor market, and how that impacts students with disabilities. If you can move on to the next one, please. And we have some resources available. We'll share those links, but they include some guiding questions that locals can ask themselves as they are going through the needs assessment related to access and equity for students with disabilities and other special populations, about the representation of different student groups in your programs, and in relationship to programs that lead to in-demand or high-wage or high-skill occupations, recruitment and barriers, accommodations and supportive services. So I encourage you, we'll post those links, and I encourage you to dig into those if you're participating in that local needs assessment process. We move on to the next one. And then again, the local needs assessment has to be used in the local application, and the local application must also describe the activities available for special populations. Next one, please. And also how recipients are going to address those performance gaps that they identified. And we'll look at the next one, please. And one tool that local recipients can use for comprehensive local needs assessment, or just more generally that local programs can use for their program evaluation and improvement, is ACTE's Quality CTE Program of Study Framework. This is an evidence-based set of standards defining what a high-quality program or program of study on the local level looks like. So we'll go on. There are 12 elements, one of which is access and equity. We can go to the next one. And in particular, this element looks at things like program of study promotion and student recruitment, as well as strategies for facilitating access and success for different student populations, whether that be with facilities and equipment, with curriculum that is unbiased, accommodations and modifications appropriately provided, supportive services, and the reduction of barriers to experiences like work-based learning. And we'll move on to the next one, please. And in particular, you know, our tool, the framework, really would support these sort of the blue-colored areas that you see on your screen, those 4 components of the comprehensive local needs assessment. And we'll go on to the next one. Thank you. And these are just a few screenshots of the tools as they are. There is a companion self-assessment. It's the standards and then just a pretty simple rubric from not at all achieved to substantially achieved that you can use to self-assess against those standards. We'll go on to the next one. You can fill that out online, and we'll go to the next slide. And then you can get an automatically calculated score report. And if you go to the next one, it'll link you to some of our online resources. So that is a quick and dirty introduction to ACTE, Perkins V, and the comprehensive local needs assessment. And now I'd like to turn it over to our last presenter, Patrick Biggerstaff.
All right, hello everyone. I am Patrick Biggerstaff, serve as Director of CTE and Adult Education for Area 31 Career Programs. We are based in Indianapolis. I also want to mention, in addition to serving as the Vice President representing administrators in the Association for Career and Tech Ed, I'm also a proud member of the Career and Tech Ed Equity Council, which focuses on equity and access for all students in career and tech ed. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I want to talk about 4 different things. I want to start out with an overview of our programs and student selection at Area 31. Talk a little bit about a key member of our staff that supports students with special needs. Talk about a model program called Thrive CTE, and then what I consider to be a very cool recognition program that's an annual recognition for people who support students with special needs here locally. So, overview of Area 31. We serve 11 school districts, homeschool students and private school students. We serve a demographic that spans urban, suburban, and rural environments, which is really one of the greatest things about this place, that there are so many people from different backgrounds coming together to learn. We have about 1,500 students every year who participate in our 3-hour secondary CTE programs. But we have, as you can see, about 17,000 total secondary CTE enrollments across our sending school district. We also have evening CTE programs for adult learners. That's an integrated education and training for adult learners, many of whom come through our high school equivalency program before coming into short-term credentialing programs in welding and CCMA and a number of other areas. But today we're really focused on the secondary student population. So in that secondary population, generally about 10 to 12% of our students each year are students with identified special needs. And they participate in better than 30 different career programs. So we have everything from aviation, dental, cybersecurity, many others. All of our programs offer college credits. Most offer industry recognized credentials. And then we have some early college programs where students earn their associate degrees actually a couple weeks before they earn their high school diploma. You can see with the logos on the right-hand side, we are an Indiana recognized STEM school, which talks to the utilization of technology as well as relationships with a lot of business owners and professionals locally. And then we are also a certified early college by CEL. That is the Center for Excellence in Leadership of Learning. So both of those things are really a testament to the work of our staff and students. We try to offer both the absolute best that we can. So we're constantly trying to be on the cutting edge. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little about our enrollment process. Certainly when students are with us for roughly 3 hours a day, 182 days, and then do that again for a second year, interest is absolutely crucial to their success. But readiness is important as well. As I mentioned, our programs are college credit. So whether you choose to apply for the college credit or not, the instruction is still set at that level. We build a lot of scaffolding in place to help students be successful. They are young learners, so we want to make sure they have every opportunity to succeed. But if you're coming into a program like heating and air conditioning, for example, their textbook has the highest Lexile score out of any other book on our high school campuses, including AP classes. So if you're not prepared to engage, it's going to be a difficult time for you. So we want to make sure that students, again, have that interest and readiness. So you can see our enrollment process. Students apply online at their convenience. Then their application is forwarded to their homeschool counselors, who assess their application and make sure that they approve or verify the readiness to participate. Applications are then sent electronically to our staff here at Area 31. So we're looking at data regarding absences, GPA, test scores, etc. Interestingly, we do not collect data on race, gender, and special needs at the time of application. Historically, there was a perception that people were gatekeeping and not allowing access to students with special needs. That is definitely not the case any longer. I can tell you that in addition to being a licensed business teacher, I was licensed in special education. My lead counselor, many other key staff members we have are licensed in special ed and really have a heart for serving all students. So when those applications come in, they are blind at that point. We sort them and we review them by a committee that represents teachers, counselors, administrators, and special education staff from all 11 of our participating school districts. After placement decisions are determined, we have our Area 31 Special Education Coordinator who works with homeschools to identify students who have special needs and to arrange necessary support. So, for example, they'll reach out, find out if the student has an IEP, what their accommodations are, if we need to make modifications to the environment before they come in, or whatever we would need to do to help that student be successful. We then have a little bit of time to plan for that. Students are then notified of their enrollment, and then we bring them out for on-site visits during the spring semester of each year prior to their enrollment in the fall. So they have a chance to come back yet again, check out the facility, meet with the teacher, make sure everyone involved has a chance to make sure, again, we're preparing for the student success in that program. Next slide, please. I want to talk a little about the role of our special education coordinator. This is a position that we fund through Carl D. Perkins funding. This gentleman is amazing. He has made an incredible difference in the success of our students. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that he does. He certainly serves on our enrollment committee, and he provides push-in and pull-out services. He started a couple years ago serving as a coach for our career and tech ed student organizations for students who want access to those programs. We are certainly going to provide them, and we were thrilled last year to have one of his students qualify for Skills USA Nationals in her presentation group. So that was thrilling for us. He coordinates meetings with our career and tech ed teachers in our career programs, along with the teachers of record from our various sending schools. He also invites all the TORs to come out and tour our programs to learn more about just the experiences that students have in programs and how we can help to prepare them for the life after graduation. He joins our CTE teachers at IEP meetings, offers professional development to teachers locally, and he is a member of our crisis intervention team. There's a little box highlighted at the bottom that we are very proud of. Last year, 95% of our students with identified special needs earned all their high school credits in the CTE program in which they were enrolled. So we were very, very proud of that success rate. Next slide, please. Okay, I want to talk a little about a program that's not technically an Area 31 career program, but it was created by our largest local sending school in our LEA in partnership with Area 31. It's called Thrive in CTE, and it supports higher functioning students with special needs. When I first came into my position in administration here in the Career Center, we had a program that sadly saw students for many hours pushing brooms down hallways. And it was sad, really. And we knew that there needed to be some change. So we worked with leadership of the local high school and their transition coordinator to talk about what might be a potential to help students reach their potential in their career path of interest. So we started this program working with a lot of our Area 31 CTE teachers, as well as the special education staff from this particular school. We developed 4 modules that students would participate in over the course of a semester. So you can see them presented: supply chain and logistics, automotive service, construction trades, and horticulture. So I'll just take auto service, for example. If you look at our CTE program, that's 10 to 12% special needs and supports that broader population. Those are set at the college level. So you have students who are working with oscilloscopes and gear ratios and things like that on a college pathway, earning dual credits and so on. And we have some students who aren't quite ready for that yet, but they can absolutely develop the skills necessary to be able to work in automotive service, doing oil changes and brakes and things like that, to be self-sufficient, to establish some confidence, and possibly transition into our advanced CTE programs at a later date. So the way this program works, again, students go through those 4 modules over the course of the semester. They come in and interact with our higher level CTE programs, as well as going and touring various facilities in industry. And then when they finish that program, they choose an area of interest and they will go and work a work-based learning experience in that area of interest the following semester. So you can see the last bullet point features simulated labs, business visits, and other work-based learning experiences. Next slide, please. Thank you. I do want to point out that, as with all of our programs, it's not just about the technical skills. It's not even about just the technical skills and knowledge, but it's also about some of these factors you see presented on the side: taking responsible risks, making mature decisions, being independent, but also being able to be interdependent, working with your collaborative groups. You can see some pictures there on the right of students working in logistics. We also have several local learning gardens that students utilize related to the horticulture pathway. Next slide, please. This is just another slide of pictures, so I'll give you a moment to look at this. We have horticulture experience and 2 transportation logistics related experiences. The top left picture is of the Grand Park Event Center in Westfield, Indiana. If you have any child who is related to sports at all, you will likely hear of that at some point. It is a very impressive couple 100-acre facility for sports complex. Next slide, please. Okay, and this is the last thing that I wanted to share. Every year we have a Dare to Dream celebration in Wayne Township. Our special education coordinator, the lady and gentleman who helped to create the Thrive CTE program, have all been recognized as a part of this. And it really is an awesome thing to see. So on the left, you see the student awards. The Daredevil shows courage when taking risks. Dream Chaser plans and works toward long-term goals. There's a peer mentor as well, who befriends students with disabilities and shows that they value the experience and personality, really, that everyone brings to the table. And then you can see on the right, less exciting, but also important, the adults who are recognized for their contributions in this field. So we feel like there are a lot of great things in Area 31, the MSD of Wayne Township, also Ben Davis High School, our local LEA high school, have done some really amazing things to support all student populations, and I'm just very excited to be a part of it. Now I believe we are on to Q&A.
Yes, we are. So thank you, everyone, for such wonderful comments and information, and giving us a framework of CTE and youth with disabilities for that. So this is sort of the lead into the next 4 webinars. We'll go into more specifics across topics. So we have a couple of questions here. Please, if you do have other questions relative to the content of today's webinar, please type them into the Q&A box, and we will have time for about 30 minutes to answer them. And so there was one to you, Mr. Biggerstaff, is how many students with IEPs does the coordinator have that he works with in CTE courses? And A, does he attend all IEP meetings at all the various high schools? And could you explain how the elective college credit works? Is it simply paying for it versus not, or if so, who pays? That's
Okay,
loaded.
that's a lot of questions.
Yeah,
So
I can break them out for you.
So again, if we're at about 10% of our 1,500 students on campus, there are about 150 students with special needs that our coordinator will interact with over the course of the year. The question regarding the electing dual credits is an interesting one that would probably require hours to answer because we're a complex system. We've got about 1/3 of our teachers are traditionally educated, like our engineering and tech ed teachers. Most of them graduated from Purdue. We've got what we call workplace specialist teachers locally who have transitioned from industry. And then we have university instructors who teach full-time on our campus. If they're a university instructor who teaches on our campus, the agreement is that all students in that classroom have to be signed up for dual credit. So the participating school corporations have that built into the tuition they pay for CTE participation every year. In our other programs, we have some school districts that pay for all dual credits. We have other school districts that don't pay for any dual credits, and it falls on the students or their parents. And then we have some local organizations that pay for, basically they scholarship dual credits for kids, depending on where they live or what their interests are, or what program they're participating in. So I hope that helps to answer questions. I, like everyone else on the panel, would be happy to have more in-depth conversations offline afterward.
Yeah, and so is there somewhere to see the Thrive CTE modules while you're still on, Patrick?
The module, seeing them as far as the ones that are listed on the slide deck, or a more in-depth description? I think they're listed on one of the slides.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't know. Is there somewhere? Yeah. Is there a link to look at them?
There's not on there at this point in time, but I can share it with you guys to be shared out if you'd like.
Okay. And here's a question that is more, I think, broader to the actual law. What are the CTE expectations for students with significant disabilities? For example, those not able to perform independently. And I'll open that up to anybody that wants to answer that.
Well, I will say, this is Tessie, under IDEA, I think the expectations for success are outlined by the IEP team, so it's the individualized outcomes. This is a question that many states have grappled with, and in previous implementation, what we found is students with the most significant disabilities who could not complete a certification course were often not provided any access because of the accountability reasons. And there are some states, like if there are folks on here from West Virginia, where they're looking at or have passed rules that allow students with more significant disabilities who cannot meet the full certification requirements to participate in that program, and then provide partial, full participation to the CTE teacher for accountability, but allow the student to receive a partial certification.
Okay.
This is Mike Harvey. In some states, CTE programs are looking to potentially develop micro-credentials. In other words, instead of moving into an automotive program and expecting to have the ASE certification, which means you are a top-level technician, some states and CTE centers are actually looking at micro-credentialing by taking families or groups of competencies, if you will, and helping students to be able to move through those level of successes, and then using work-based learning or co-op opportunities to have those students go out into business and industry. Florida, I think, is doing a pretty good job with this, and there are other states that are exploring this as well. But that potentially is a model. The fifth webinar in this particular series also speaks to programs that are best practice or moving towards best practice. And Jim Kraft, who's the executive director at Berks County Career and Technical Center here in Pennsylvania, has an innovative program which he has set up in collaboration with WIOLA and VR that talks about serving students with more challenging needs in career and technical education. And they've actually developed a unique model, a unique design feature for program services. So you may want to jump in on that fifth webinar and listen to Jim's conversation as well. But I think CTE is in many cases and in many ways exploring opportunities. And I think the Perkins V legislation potentially opens the door for more collaboration and more interactions. Thanks.
All right. So anybody else? Okay.
Can I add something to that, Deanne?
Yes.
This is Dawn Rowe. Sorry. I would also emphasize that, especially back to Tessie's comment about the individualized education program, that the IEP teams are really looking at fit and whether or not the career technical education is a match for students with the most significant needs, and it is of their interest, because that's probably a thing you'd want to, is similar to employment opportunities and other things, is you want to make sure that the preparation that you're providing is actually going to lead them to their desired post-school goals. And so that is definitely a decision that the IEP team needs to make. And CTE can certainly meet their needs. And for some students with more intensive support needs, they may require additional modifications or potentially, as Mike mentioned, do micro-credentialing versus the full certification. But it's really important as we're leveraging CTE as a valuable transition service for students with disabilities, that we are ensuring that the courses that they take really do align with their interest in their post-school goals.
All right. Thank you, Dawn. Then there's another question about students on modified curriculum can now receive an endorsement. Do you have any tools to train teachers, specifically on industry certified teachers, on how to modify their curriculum? And I think that may be addressed in some of our continuing in the series. It's continues. Mike, is there, did you all want to elaborate on that? Or even answer the question about resources?
In many ways, and if I'm understanding the question correctly, CTE teacher preparation is handled at the state level. I know here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, we have 3 CTE, they're CTE personal professional development centers. So Temple University in the eastern portions of our state, Penn State in the central portion of the state, and Indiana University of Pennsylvania, IUP, in the western portion of the state, actually work with new CTE teachers and those who have come into the profession. And I can speak for the Penn State program. We do have courses, because of state law, that indicate 6 hours of special needs, special education training, and also 3 hours of ELL training. So curriculum modifications and adaptations and those things are embedded in some of the courses that our CTE instructors go through. I think the other thing that's going to be important, particularly in Perkins V, and Catherine can speak to this as well, is that the Perkins V legislation specifically says that professional development in relationship to students with disabilities is something that must happen for CTE teachers so that they can be better trained, better equipped with knowledge and skills to help support, particularly accommodations, behavior modification, positive interventions, and those kinds of things. So I think there's opportunity there. And as I said in my presentation, the key, I think, that's important is to take a look at the local level and having special education work with CTE and identify where there are some trainings. In the second webinar series, we will talk more specifically about partnerships and collaboration, but that's an initiative that I think needs to happen, and I would encourage folks to move into that second webinar series to find out more about this. Thanks.
Okay, and here's a very broad question, but with respect to integration of programs authorized under ESSA, IDEA, Perkins V, and WIOA, is anyone tracking which states are undertaking this effort? If so, has there been an evaluation of success? You know, what are some lessons learned or pitfalls to avoid?
That's a great question. I would say, so we've been, this came out a couple months ago, so I don't think it's been in place long enough for an evaluation quite yet, but we have been working and talking with states that have been interested in this work. And I will say, as we move forward with them, typically they don't decide to integrate all of this all at once. Often it's based on some sort of priority in the state where they start to focus, and we actually encourage that. We're finding more meaningful collaboration in a smaller focus so that people start to learn, gain trust across these different sectors, start to build relationships, and then we find that it grows from there. But thus far, no one is tracking it necessarily. It's pretty open, designed to be a tool and resource to catalyze further integration in the states and in local areas. And but it has been, some states have expressed a lot of interest. I will say, I do find that states that are most interested have some other support outside the agencies, including like a governor that wants to create, has a workforce agenda. That's happened in quite a few states as well.
Okay, great, Susan. Anybody else want to add? And so, Patrick, we have lots of questions for you. So they want to know a little bit more about the enrollment process. Specifically, that on your slide you said number 4 for sorting applications, and then number 5. I need to go slide back to those slides, unless you know off the top of your head.
I have the slides right next to me on a different screen.
Okay.
So number 4 is applications sorted and reviewed by committee. So that is when they're looking at data regarding absences. So for example, if you're credit deficient, we can't put you in a 3-hour CTE program, because the expectation from our state is that once you come into the program, you need to finish the program. I have lots of concerns with that. I think students need to be able to onboard and offboard as they're comfortable doing so, because they're still young and they need to explore. But as far as our state is concerned, if you get off track and you're not a concentrator, then we as the school have not done our job of inspiring you to stay in that pathway. So if students are credit deficient, we know they don't have the opportunity to complete the pathway, then they're going to the bottom of the pack, or the bottom of that stack. So what happens when everybody gets sorted, you end up with kids who have interest, and they also have the objective data that shows they have the readiness to get into the class. They go into kind of section A, and then let's say their GPA is a little bit lower, they have more absences, they go into section B. As they fall down a little bit in that order, if there are still seats available, then we're having conversations with their homeschool counselor and their parents. We're bringing the students in to meet with teachers and talk about the programs to ensure that appropriate fit, and then making placement decisions based on that. So students always, as they apply, they identify their first, second option. They have the opportunity to identify their third option. And then this whole process begins with the, 25 people per year that are on this committee, kind of evaluating where students are when they come in.
Okay, great. And don't get off, Patrick, because there's one more
Sure.
question for you.
Sure.
They want to know if you have any progress tracking forms that your staff use that you could share with us. And that'd be great to have some examples to reference and adopt as districts need and want.
So we track through a system called the Indiana Technical Education Reporting System that is tracking the enrollment and progress of every student. And then of course, locally, we're watching factors like their attendance and their progression from one semester to another. So I don't know that we have a specific form because we just print documents out from this technical reporting system that we utilize at the state level.
Okay, great. Thank you, Patrick.
You're welcome.
And then we have another question that goes out broadly to all of you. In addition to resources presented today, what other resources or professional organizations can folks explore to learn about other examples of models for leveraging resources across these federal initiatives? Thanks, Catherine, for that question. Additional resources, organizations? I think ACTE is, I don't know if that helps with leveraging across.
I'm going to say in general terms, the two co-hosts that are in this webinar series, both NTACT and ACTE, have a number of resources. Obviously, NTACT dealing with CTE and support services for IEPs in transition, critical to that organization. But ACTE also has a wealth of information that provides good data, good resources, and good information around students with disabilities and more broadly special populations. So I would take some time to look at both of those websites and the resources that are available there.
And this is Catherine. There's we also have a kind of a partner organization called Advanced CTE. They represent the state directors of career and technical education, and they have a number of resources, including an equity series that they just published within the last year or so. So I would recommend that people look for them as well, Advanced CTE, careertech.org.
Great, thank you. And here, this is a question. I don't know if it's for you specific, Patrick, or I'll open up to any of our presenters. When addressing work-based learning experiences, how is hands-on or community-based experiences embedded into the educational curriculum?
Sorry, I was trying to get my video going. So for us, it's embedded in all of our programs. We believe very strongly in having guest teachers come into the classroom from industry, so we're building some familiarity there. But then we are very fortunate to have lots of minibuses and buses available that can support short-term work-based learning experiences, longer-term work-based learning experiences. So for us, we see tremendous value in having students go and see and participate in industry, building relationships, finding mentors among people in our community who might help to inspire them over time.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I think we're narrowing the questions down and this one might be for you, Mike, since you're from Pennsylvania, are there any CTE programs for adults in Philadelphia, Bucks County?
That's a pretty specific question.
I know.
I have to be honest with you, and I don't mean to be glib, but I honestly do not know. But what I would suggest is, because Bucks County is in the greater Philadelphia area, you may want to contact Temple University and the Professional Personal Development Center that is there and speak with folks there who would know really much more in the eastern portion of the state what is happening there. So that might be a resource to track down.
All right. And that's a good guide for making this a more broader question, is like how to find specific CTE programs. So
Yeah, and I
anyway,
want to, this is Tessie, and I
Mhm.
saw that Linda had mentioned that there are some vocational technical schools in Lower Bucks and Middle Bucks County.
Oh, I just saw that. Great, thank you. Are there any other questions that people have? If not,
I just want to get back to the person from Pennsylvania very quickly as well. The Pennsylvania Department of Education's Bureau of Career and Technical Education, Dr. Lee Burkett is the executive director. They have a listing of all of the career and technical centers in the Commonwealth. So the PDE website, and under PDE, look for career and technical ed. There are a variety of resources that are there, including all of the centers that offer career and technical education across the Commonwealth.
okay, great. Another question just came in. Do you have any specific information related to students that are blind or visually impaired as it relates to CTE opportunities? And that may be addressed in our future webinar series.
Well, this is Tessie, and I will say that CCRS has done a series of webinars last year that targeted state departments of education. And there are some great examples of CTE programs that have successfully included students who are visually impaired or deaf, in which they collaborated with the deaf school or the specific state department providing those supports. So there actually is a lot of evidence and evidence-based practices in this particular area that we will share, I think, in later webinars, but you can also access on those CCRS webinars.
And I think that that's an excellent resource, Tessie. Thank you for sharing that. I also will say in our 5th webinar, looking at, again, moving towards best practices, we have folks from the state of Ohio who have been actively working together, building interagency collaboration. And so this may be a webinar that you will want to potentially tune into and maybe ask specific questions like that to the state of Ohio, because they are trying to build cross collaboratives. I also know that NTACT has a capacity building institute, and states, again, across the nation are working on having CTE work with VR, work with special education, and work with the departments of education to have more of a seamless set of skill sets and programs and offerings and resources, as opposed to having these all be siloed and compartmentalized. And I know NTACT has worked closely on that, and Deanna or Dawn, I'll let you take from there.
Right, and so if you do have specific questions relative to that, you can reach out to NTACT. If you go to our website, there's an opportunity to ask questions, and it'll be funneled to the correct person that can answer that question, and we can point you to some of our resources that are on our website, which is at transitionta.org, and it was in the chat box way at the top of the chat box if you're interested in that. With that in mind, I'm going to do a little marketing for the rest of the webinar series. So if you, I didn't mean to do that, that will be coming up. The next one will be September 19th about effective partnerships, followed by the one on classroom supports, then classroom management, and then, as Mike had just talked about, best practices. So it gives you a broad overview of some specific key elements that are needed to ensure that students with disabilities can persist and succeed in career and technical education. So with that, there is a link in for the evaluation in the chat box. We would really appreciate feedback on this NTACT, and I know ACTE really uses this as formative information to support and shape our future webinars. So we'd really appreciate you completing the evaluation. And then also in the chat box is our link to the NTACT's website. So with that, I really want to thank all of our presenters, and I truly think a lot of great information was shared to folks across this nation. So thank you very much. And with that, we can end the webinar.